That actually leads nicely into this week's guest. This week I got to speak to Harry Morgan, who is the creator and host of the Jog On podcast.
Right.
Have you ever listened to Jog On itself or heard of it?
I think I've heard of it, yeah.
He definitely hadn't heard of it.
When I met Harry, which was probably about a year and a half ago, I was preparing for the CCC and the Grand Union race. And yeah, he invited me onto his show to kind of have a chat about long distance running. So I was a guest on his show beginning of last year. And yeah, just a lovely chap. Took me for a run around Southampton, and yeah, now the tables have turned, and managed to speak to him and find out all about his running and how he got started, and a lot about his father's running and the shows themselves. So we got to speak a little bit about podcasting and how the experience has been for him. So yeah, it was a really, really good chat.
So it's like podcast wars, was it?
It does. It was kind of like, yeah, when podcasts collide.
When podcasts collide. I quite like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, Dave, listen, thanks so much, man, for joining me this week. And we're going to go into the interview now. And I wish you all the best for your recovery and look forward to hooking up for a run soon.
You might at this point be wondering what the heck is going on. I'll try to summarise. As Daniel just mentioned, if you've been listening to this podcast long enough, you may remember the Jog On episode with Daniel Del Piccolo.
When you're running, you're feeling the ground beneath your feet. You're like, you can hear the crunch of the dirt and stuff. And there's something really, again, meditative about that.
Well, turns out he went away from that conversation so utterly inspired by my work. I'm kidding. But he did go away and create his own show. It's called the Portsmouth Running Podcast. And I must say, with his passion for running, accompanied by his smooth South African tones, Daniel has a natural flair for it. Then recently, he dropped me a message, inviting me to be a guest. This was the first time that I've been invited on as a main guest to another podcast. What you're about to hear is that conversation. Of course, this was published on the Portsmouth Running Podcast itself, but I decided to release this here as a main guest episode on Jog On. One, because it follows the format of a guest episode, but also because Daniel really went into the depths of how running began for me and how I ended up here, right now, in front of this microphone. Perhaps you'll allow me to be as presumptive as to hope that even if you're the mildest Jog On fan, you might be quite interested just to hear a little bit about my own story. One brief call to action for today. If you get a moment and want to give something back to Jog On, recommend to a friend that they give Jog On a listen. It goes a lot further than you might think. Towards the end of this episode, I do discuss the recent Will Cockrell episode that was released on Jog On. At the time it hadn't been released, of course that is now readily available, so do go check that out. It was great to speak with Daniel again, even if this time I was in the opposite chair. So, courtesy of the Portsmouth Running Podcast, please welcome to Jog On, myself.
Harry, welcome to the Portsmouth Running Podcast. As I always start with, I very much appreciate you taking the time to come on and join the podcast. And I know it's been a while since we last spoke. In fact, I think the last time we spoke in any full length, I was a guest on your show. So this is a complete spin around and you're on the chair. So Harry Morgan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's quite weird to have flipped it and be in the opposite chair, if you like. It's a strange feeling. And I feel like usually I have notes in front of me and things like that for a guest, so I've got information about them. But for this one, I didn't really have anything. I can't sort of, it should be in my head, so I shouldn't be able to write notes about myself down. So it is a little odd. It's like I'm sort of not quite as in control as I was.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got all the notes on you this time, so yeah, I guess you've got the spotlight on you now. So I hope you enjoy the experience and just have fun with it, man. I'm really looking forward to finding out about all your running.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate being invited on. It's quite cool.
And actually, I think we were recently in touch as well a few weeks ago, or maybe even about a month ago, because one of your guests, John Green, ran 100 miles of the South Downs Way over 4 days.
Yeah, that was mad. He just popped up out of nowhere. Weirdly, I met him in a specialist running shop on the clothing floor and got talking to him. He was browsing rucksacks at the time. And It turned out from this conversation that he was doing this 100-mile run in a couple of weeks or something. And he was talking about sort of getting a bit of promotion for it. And I just happened to mention, I said, well, I host a running podcast and you could possibly come on and maybe have a chat with me. That might give it a bit of oomph to get some donations in or something. He said, oh, that'd be fantastic. So he dropped me an email and we set it up and had a chat and it just went excellent. His story was amazing. He was running for a family member who was going through some health difficulties with cancer. And this is why he was doing it, to raise funds for the guy to go over and get some special treatment in a foreign country. And it was just this incredible story. And then that went even further than the podcast and turned into me actually joining him for one of the legs. I know that he spoke to you as well about possibly joining as a did you ever get to meet him and run with him in the end?
Do you know, I didn't, and it was purely work based. I just couldn't find a decent time to go up and join him. But I was following him and tracking him on Strava. And it was a real shame. I guess I gave him some advice on the route and spoke to him a few times over social media. But yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get out to join him. So it was a real shame. But I know you did, and yeah, it looked like you had a good time up there.
It was great, yeah. So he'd run quite a few miles before I met him, and then I joined him for something like another 8 or 9, which is absolutely nothing compared to the 100 he was doing over the 4 days. And he looked in pretty good nick when I saw him. He was doing all right. I think where it started to tell was when he was running uphill. His quads were starting to seize up a bit, and I think that's where it was starting to. So I joined him on, I've got to remember this all correctly now, it was only a few weeks ago, but I'm pretty sure I joined him on his second day, and he had 2 more to go. So he was, I saw him pretty fresh, and then I sort of checked in with him at the end of the 3rd and then the final day. And yeah, he got through the whole thing. He did say his quads played up on him quite a bit, but amazing. And then from that, I filmed a bit, so I was able to do a bit of video for the YouTube channel that I do as well. Just from one conversation on the clothing floor of a running store, all of a sudden all this stuff came, and yeah, it's an amazing experience. It was fun. It was good. I really enjoyed it.
I tell you what, it's a fine example of what I always call the spice of life. These kind of moments that just explode out of nowhere and turn into something like that, an experience like that. I mean, it's just amazing. I love it.
And I think as you get a bit older as well, you realize that times, I mean, this is getting a bit heavy already, but time's ever getting slightly shorter every year that passes. It's my birthday in just a couple of weeks' time. And it always, as I find as the birthday's approaching, it makes me think a little bit more about, am I doing the right thing? What am I going to do next? How am I going to make the most of this before entering the next decade, etc. And I think so moments like that where he sort of said, well, I mean, I'm looking for people to join me. Back when you're in a teenager or even sort of very early 20s, you might be a little more hesitant to jump on moments like that. But I think now I'm already entering a stage, still youthful while I am, to just say yes to things. So that I was just like, I'll do it with you. I mean, I've only just met you, but I'll do it with you kind of thing. And let's sit down and have a chat. And you find very quickly that the moment you say yes, you almost never regret it. And these amazing opportunities show up. And yeah, it was nice. It was great to support him.
Fantastic. That's really great that you did. And yeah, I'm just really pleased that kind of meet happened like that. It's just, one of those lovely coincidences in life, which is fantastic. But listen, I've got to admit, Harry, this has been like a real nerve wrecker for me, because you're obviously a very experienced podcaster yourself, and you've got your own running show called Jog On. And before we go into it and kind of speak all about the Jog On bit, I wanted to ask how the show's been going since lockdown. Have you any effects on the recordings you've done, or the frequency that you've been dishing shows out?
That's a great question. I would say not really. Download figures have stayed pretty similar, possibly even down a little bit from what they usually would be. It's funny because I actually had quite a few people say to me when lockdown started, they said, oh, this is amazing. Jog On's going to get downloaded so many times because everyone's going to be sat at home with nothing to do. But unfortunately, it just didn't quite work like that. And I was dubious of that theory anyway, because a lot of people, just from, you'll know this, when you do a podcast, it's weird because you see it being downloaded a reasonable amount of times or whatever, but you very rarely hear back. They're usually passive listeners. You don't hear back like where they're listening, where it was, etc. I've got a little bit of stuff that can show me in what country they were listening, etc. on some of my stats. Other than that, not a huge amount. Whenever I do hear something back, quite often it's things like they were in the car on the way to work, or they listen on their particular run. And you do find that you often fit into a routine somewhere. And because those routines were completely corrupted by the strange situation we're in at the moment, I found that actually that tended to knock a lot of people's lives out of kilter. And as a result, perhaps their usual listening patterns. So generally, no, it didn't have that effect that perhaps my optimistic mother thought, that all of a sudden I was going to get 500,000 downloads out of nowhere because we'd all ground to a halt. So generally, no. And in terms of actual producing content, it just forced me to really make sure I was doing the phone call stuff, like the video call, for example, that we're doing right now, doing it over Skype. Things like that are incredible tools, and all of a sudden you can reach someone quite far. If there's a guy in Edinburgh who's just run a marathon, you or I can chat to him within moments with the beauty of technology now, and I think that's a huge advantage. So trying to grasp that a little more. And there was a stage when I sort of was a bit too purist and was like, I only want to talk to people face to face, so they've got a proper microphone in front of them and all this. And very quickly you realize it's not about that. It's about who the person is and the conversation itself, not necessarily just because you want that little extra bit of quality and be able to stare them in the eyes, which you and I are able to do, and that does create a beautiful episode. But you can do so much now over the computer. So yeah,
it's really easy. And I myself met with my first, I think it was my first 13, 14, 15 guests face to face. And it was a little bit dubious about doing it over Skype, but it works really well. The technology's come on leaps and bounds over the years. It's safe, it's easy. It kind of, you've got your own backup in the cloud, which is great. And just what you touched on earlier as well, talking about routines and stuff, I think you hit the nail on the head. Because I myself, as a podcast listener, have got tons of them backed up now because I was listening on my commute into work every day. So there you go. So truth in that for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So on to the running subject. How has it been over lockdown? How's motivation? How's racing?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be in a bubble with one or two other people who run. So I think that helped a bit. Generally, yeah, pretty positive. It's weird. It seems to me like people kind of went one way or the other. So say you take your average, let's say there's a guy called Joe and he's out running 3 times a week. Lockdown happens. If you put Joe in parallel universes, one Joe all of a sudden just starts eating jam sandwiches and biscuits and just sits on the sofa and the running goes out the window, like I think we just discussed, the routine goes. And then the other Joe in the other universe seems to have just taken off. And other people I knew who almost ran themselves to injury because they were just going out running every day because they had the time to do it. And they thought, well, I might as well run again. So it seems to have gone either way. I tended to be a little bit more on the side of I probably ran even more during lockdown. Not a crazy amount. I didn't push it too hard. Also, less constraint on time. So I was quite happy to all of a sudden, where I would usually just do a Sunday long run, all of a sudden a Wednesday long run and a Tuesday long run was happening. And just really low intensity, low heart rate stuff. That was kind of it for me. What about you? Did you run a lot over lockdown?
I did actually. I think I was probably the third universe Joe, if I can just pop a third universe in there, where I was the Joe that did more running and more eating. So I was kind of floating in between, or maybe floating in between the two universes. But definitely doing a bit of both.
Absolutely. It is hard. I mean, I think diet suffered for a lot of people. A lot of people fall into that camp of the eating thing because if you're around the house more, the fridge is right there, cupboards are right there, you're not quite as distracted. And I think naturally our brain does send us signals that you should probably get some calories now. And that happens more and more often and you're not out at work and busy with other things. So,
but yeah, no, it's generally the running was good. I don't know if you kind of my own challenges. Had a nasty accident falling down the stairs during lockdown, which took me out for a few weeks. Yeah, I took a tumble down the stairs, really injured my lower back, which is still problematic, but I'm actually back running. Other than that, it's been pretty good.
How did you fall down the stairs? Just a general slip, or you were carrying something?
Well, it was running related because I was on my way to an early run on the South Downs Way with my co-host Dave Harvey and his girlfriend Heather. Yeah, just walking down quietly, holding everything in my hands, so no hands to grab onto the banister rail with. My foot slipped from beneath me and just crashed down on my lower back. Fortunately, not my spine; it was to the side, but. Wow. Yeah, it was very, very bad at the time, and I thought that I was going to be out for longer than I was. But again, it's just another interesting story to tell.
Yeah, of course.
But anyway, enough of the stairs. And I'm glad the running's been going well during lockdown because, like you say, a lot of people have been non-motivated by the lack of races. But that's good to hear that your training's going well. And yeah, I'm just keen to kind of now, I guess, dig into a little bit of the start. So if you don't mind, just a very, very quick introduction, like before we go into the start of your running.
Yeah.
And this is going to kind of summarize what you're going to go into. You grew up with running in a family, and I guess your love for running started early on. You've competed at cross country and track and various races, and you've captained the University of Portsmouth Athletics, which is fantastic. You've also done multi-day ultra, over 100 miles, which is fantastic. But on top of that, and I think very much like in a complementary way to the running, you've got a running podcast, as I mentioned earlier, called Jog On. You've been involved in radio. You've now got a YouTube channel going. So, wowzers. I'm not too sure where to start, but I guess at the beginning, where did all the running start?
Do you know, I was speaking to my parents the other day and I was asking if I ever ran in the 90s. So I was born in 91 and obviously coming into 2000 being only 9 years old, not many 9-year-olds have entered a race. And it turns out that there was one time there was some sort of festival type thing, family fun day, and there was a fun run that day. So we kind of we think it's probably about 97, 98. I'm still yet to narrow that down. Somewhere in a photo album, it should tell me because there's a picture taken. But that was my first ever race. Going back even earlier than that, my dad was really into 3 big things: bird watching, fun, cricket, and then running. Those were the main 3. And I think that there was always perhaps a desire in him that his son would take up one of the 3, which I did. I mean, bird watching, I could tell you quite a lot about birds because of not even being that interested, but just being taken on holidays where we went to bird hides and stuff to look through binoculars, but never really took it up. And then cricket, I played for about 6 years and I became just slightly above atrocious with a bat, but never took to cricket. But for some reason, just always had a very strong passion for running. Never showed much promise as a kid, but for whatever reason stuck with it and just got great enjoyment from running and held out long enough to see myself become moderate to okay at that discipline. So very early on, I think the idea of races and that smell of deep heat was normalized for me as a child because I was pushed around in a pram and taken to races because my dad would race a lot with the clubs he was running for. He was part of multiple clubs Great Western Runners in Bristol was one of his main clubs, who you can always recognise from a sort of pale blue vest and then a sort of a darker V on the chest. And that's etched into my memory, this vest. But I think just cheering him round and seeing flashes of him running past, I think as a kid, you just accept that as the norm. So whilst I'm quite a big believer in biology and things happening through nature, if you want an argument for nurture, perhaps, that some of that running scene was normalised within me quite early on. So perhaps that's a reason why I sort of took to it.
That just, you've described that so well. That's amazing, especially the smell of the sweat and the deep heat and stuff, I guess.
You can take the lid off some deep heat and smell it, and everyone gets different images, but my mental image goes straight back to races and then myself being a teenager. I remember being in crowded clubhouses for club runs, because big city runs are amazing, but sometimes it's those weird, quirky sort of late night evening runs where there's a couple of marshals and you're just running down the side of a road with a couple of traffic cones. There's no crowd, no one's there. It's just people who just race for the love of racing. I remember I once won 4 cans of lager for my age group, and I was too young to even get it, so they had to present it to my dad. Just little memories like that, are very strong, I think, and they can be set off by things like smells.
Yeah. So were those 4 cans of lager for a kiddie's race?
It was just so unpoliced. It was one of those races where the guy was like, "Oh no, well, you can have lager as well," and he just kind of gave my dad them, and there was sort of a laugh from that.
Did you ever join your father on runs as a kid? Did you ever go out kind of training with him, and evenings at home and stuff?
Yeah, I did. I think you have a natural aspiration to do perhaps what your father does. Maybe there's a sort of a son-father instinct there. And so seeing him leave and put his shoes on, I mean, I don't remember it, but I'm sure at some point I would have requested that I join him. My earliest memories of going running with him are sort of once we'd moved, I grew up north, and then we moved to the Cotswolds in 2000. The Cotswolds is a lovely area, very hilly in many parts, so naturally grew up running up hills, and I think that probably helped a little bit to form a little bit of a foundation anyway for some basic fitness. But I remember doing runs with him, but then quite quickly him explaining to me sort of efforts and things like that. So I remember there being a 2.1 mile loop. It was nothing crazy. He'd make me do it twice, make me as though he cracked the whip, but I remember vividly doing that and parking up the car, getting out and sort of stretching in the side of the car like he did. I remember once a lorry did actually pull up and say, "Do you need a push? Do you need some help?" Because they thought we were generally trying to push the car, but we were just stretching against it. So I joined him, and I think that you naturally aspire to sort of do something. And I wasn't big on cricket, I wasn't big on bird watching, but for whatever reason, running I just fell in love with.
You actually interviewed your father, and Steve Morgan is your dad's name, obviously. And I've got to add that I think in that interview, there was something that you spoke about with your dad that really struck a chord with me. The thoughts around racing pressures and the pressure of actually entering a race and stuff. The training more seriously, and the racing is more of like a little bit of a training run or just a bit of fun. Do you remember speaking about that topic with your dad at all? I think he was saying just, enjoy your running. And I think you were saying that you prefer the training and lead up to a race rather than the race itself.
I do, yeah. Do you know what? It's a weird one. It's not. So there's a big camp of runners out there who are very much just all about training, and they're really not bothered by races. And I don't think that it's not. I'm not bothered by racing. I absolutely love racing, and I'm very proud of personal bests, and those moments are incredible. I think it's because I know what it's like to really push yourself and really, let's be honest about it, hurt yourself to get those faster times. And it's such an unpleasant experience during, as amazing as it feels afterwards. And for me, it takes days to recover from something like that I tend not to race that often. And I tend to find, I think probably what I was talking to him about there was, I think one of the things I've struggled with a little bit is when I'm very clearly not in PB shape, which I guess theoretically is most of my life, because there's only these moments where I've been in that peak form for me, that races become, I struggle to sort of race knowing that I'm going to be nowhere near the personal best today. And that's something I think I've started to improve on a bit. For a long time, you go through that period where you're just on an upward slant, and every time you race, you knock a few seconds off, because naturally you're just getting fitter and as you're racing more and more, and things are on the up. You won't keep going up forever. At some point, you have to either have a run where it's about the same or it's a little bit worse, and you have to be completely okay with that. And I think that's something I was not too familiar with, was kind of racing and just forgetting about the time.
No, it's very interesting. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, similar to you, I love racing, and I think you described it really well there. You hurt yourself during a lot of those efforts, but listen, back to your dad. So your dad Steve's had some incredible times logged for his various distances, and I'm going to go through some of them now, simply because I remember when I first met you, you said that one of your goals and aims was to, not in a very competitive way, but just in a legacy way or some description, like to try and hit some of those targets and try and see if you can get close or even better some of those times, which I'm sure your dad fully supports. But your dad for 10K has run a 35:03. Your 10K is 37:49. So do you think you can do it?
I mean, I'll try and give you the very short answer. When you surround yourself with people who really dedicate themselves to running and you see how they train and you realize that you've got 37:49 through perhaps 60% of what they're doing, that if I were to jack it up from a 60% training effort, if you like, up to a sort of an 85 or even a 90%, I think it's incredible what people are capable of when they really do train and focus and nail down good training. So I believe it's possible, but I know what I'd have to go through and how much I'd have to dedicate to do it.
Okay. So listen, so that's 10K. 10 miles, 1:04 for you, which is an incredibly speedy time. Your dad's 10-mile time is 57:38, which is really rapid. So that's kind of well under the hour mark. If you go for that one, that's going to be a tough one. But I know that you kind of said, kind of edging more towards you could probably break the marathon time for your dad. And I don't have your dad's marathon time listed here.
I can tell you. So his half marathon, just still tracking on the web, his half marathon is 1:15, which is probably arguably one of his strongest performances. Yes. 1:15 for a half is moving very, very well. Very high level club running. In my opinion, depends who you surround yourself with. There are other people who, scoff at 1:10 because they've met the greatest, if you like, the best of the best. But compared to most mere mortals, 1:15 is very rapid. His marathon is an interesting story. I'll just go into very quickly.
Yeah,
he never, I think he would own up to himself, and probably does on one of the episodes I've done with him, that he never fulfilled his potential at the marathon. I had a guest on recently on an episode of Jog On, actually, and he talked about, at the time, he said, every elite runner in their life, any runner probably gets maybe 3 or 4 perfect marathons after lots of marathon racing. The marathon becomes kind of like playing with fire. So much can happen. So much can go wrong. You can do the most perfect training, the most perfect build up, fuel yourself fantastically, and something can happen, mile 21, and things can just switch off, and you never quite know when that's going to happen, but you do your best to prepare for that. And I think for him, he just never had that perfect marathon. It never came together. He would say himself he was probably capable of about 2:45 marathon. His best ever was officially 2:52, though bearing in mind, he again would sort of deny this. He's very strong that it has to be 2:52 because that was the official time. But I like to also add that on his watch that day, he did get 2:50 because there weren't chip timing. So, it takes 2 minutes for him to even get over the line at that point. So really, him crashing out, I think he sort of died in the last 3-4 miles. His last 3-4 miles was almost walking pace. He completely crashed off, having been on time for something in the 2:40 to 2:45 range. My personal belief, I think he probably could have gone sub 2:40 if he'd really had the right coaching and training from a kid. But things were a bit different back then. I think they sort of had a cup of soup at night and then go to bed, and they'd wake up in the morning and never stretch or do all these other things. So it was a different mentality back then. So marathon, if cannot be accused of being a little bit criminal in my approach, because arguably he sort of never quite got it right. I feel like that's the one that's got the most potential that I could get it. I feel like I could go for that. But again, it's going to take months and months and months of dedication, time, hard work to prepare for this. So that's the lay of the land with him. He's just a bit too good, and I do sometimes question it, but I would love to take down one of his personal bests, and hopefully he'll support me in that.
Absolutely. Well, it's been lovely chatting about that, and kind of it's lovely to hear that you drew so much inspiration and I guess good memories from the running when you were a child. So I mean, it's given you all these cool stories and experiences now in your own life. So it's fantastic that it kind of carries on, and your dad must be proud as well.
I hope so.
I'm sure he is. So listen, so obviously running was a big part of your childhood. Did you do any running at school? The school side of things, there must have been a competitive running team or a cross-country team or something like that at the school.
Yeah, so it goes back reasonably early. Year 5 of primary school, I joined the primary school cross-country team. So I had 2 years at primary school, and this is once we'd sort of moved to the Cotswolds, and I was at this primary school. And I remember in year 4, we had to stand up in assembly if we wanted to join for that season or whatever it was of the cross-country primary school, and I didn't. I remember some kids standing up. I mean, what a weird way, if you're a shy kid, to make you stand up in assembly for they could do a head count of who was in the cross-country team. So I sort of backed away from that because I was year 4 of primary school. I remember that. But then year 5, I stood up and I joined. I decided, I remember my parents saying, no, you should join. So next year, year 5, I joined the primary school cross-country team. And I remember doing laps of the field and running around. Sometimes the headmaster, he was called Mr. Williams, would come with us, and it was probably a half decent runner at the time. He seemed like amazing because he was an adult, so he could trump us all. But But I remember the racing other primary schools. That's probably the most vivid thing, is going down to what ended up being my secondary school and the huge playing field they had there. And especially when you're a kid, it seems like this mammoth area. And we do basically a lap of the field was the primary school cross country races. And there would be something like 7 or 8 local primary schools. And there was something about it. I just got a huge kick as a kid, a huge adrenaline rush from doing it.
That's amazing.
And it's crazy because I never placed that highly. I still remember my best ever placing. This is how much it's etched into my memory. 32nd was the best I ever placed. Now, this is out of 100 kids. And you might say, okay, top third, that's good. But, to have 31 primary school kids beating you, I did not show promise. And that was just through pure effort. Probably 50 of those kids were, on their Game Boy or crying or something. So, the competition was not there. There was nothing about it that made me show some kind of strong promise or athleticism there. But for whatever reason, I kept going back and I just enjoyed it. And I think I liked seeing my parents cheering me. There was something quite strong about that. There's a picture of my dad holding my arms or slightly across my chest. He's kind of half hugging me. It's somewhere in a family photo album. I'm in my primary blue. You can tell I've been crying, and I was crying because it hurt so much. So I clearly pushed myself as a kid as well. Just things like that. And I think they really do stay with you, memories like that. So that was my kind of primary school experience, and then moved on and took it to secondary school.
Wow. So your memories of running are all positive, even though the placings weren't high. You obviously clearly had a love for it, and obviously you've got that strong family bond with the running. So I think it's just a kind of almost like the perfect recipe for a nice future in the sport. So that's all good. But listen, in 2011, now this is where the Portsmouth link comes into play. So I guess you joined the University of Portsmouth in 2011 and then signed up for the athletics club there?
Absolutely. I remember the day very vividly. There was a long tent with all the Portsmouth societies for the university, and there was everything you could imagine, the Mandarin Society and the Rock Society and the Surfing Society. And I remember going into that tent thinking that I was going to do 2, potentially a third one, but I knew that would probably be taken on a bit much. And I knew that one was absolutely going to be the athletic club, because there was no sort of cross country or running specific. It was athletics. But anyone that knows athletics clubs, 80% of that is made up from runners of all sorts of distances, and then you might get one guy that throws javelin, for example. And
I've always wondered that, actually. I've always wondered about the, when you speak of an athletics club, there's clearly other sports involved, but I tend to always think about running. So I guess the split is very much focused and centered on the running.
Very much so. And then you get your sprinters, your middle distance, and then you've got your long distance runners. And then, as I say, sometimes, I remember just after I left, you still go back sometimes and visit. There was a girl who just started doing high jump. We had one guy who was called, I don't want to get his name wrong. He was called Jordan. I remember his first name was Jordan. Anyway, he was a very talented triple jumper, which was strange because he was a really short guy. And all the triple jumpers tend to be quite sort of lithe and athletic and quite tall. But he's just a fantastic triple jumper. So he used to go and do triple jump for us at competitions. So we'd always cheer him on, and those were nice moments. But the rest of us really, one guy I remember throwing a shot put a couple of times because he was pretty strong, but really it was mainly made up of runners. But I marched right up to this guy called Daniel Green, who was the captain of the athletics club at the time. Everyone's trying to get you to join their society, having clipboards thrust all over the place. And I said to him, you don't need to convince me. Literally day one of freshers university, I just knew that's what I wanted to be a part of. But no, and then from that moment I have 3 years of absolutely wonderful memories, some of which I'll never forget, with this team that was athletics that you became so close to. There's such a bonding experience as well. I got to know the people in my house quite well, and I got to know people in my course very well, but there was nothing quite like the relationships that you developed in the athletics club at university. If I always say, every once in a while I come across someone who's about to start university, and my biggest recommendation is always to join a society, because the friendships you make there are just unbelievable. It's a different experience.
That's brilliant. And being a different experience, how much did it differ from the running that you had done at school or that you had seen from a club point of view? How different is it in the fact that you're obviously there to focus on the education side of things? How did it all fit in with that and fit in with your kind of weekly schedule?
It fitted in pretty well. So I studied drama and performance at university. The whole plan had been to go to acting school, but I decided I really wanted the university experience first. So I went and did that. And universities are weird. A lot of courses, you only have a few lectures a week. So you really have quite a malleable framework with which to work with. And a big part of that was being able to fit athletics around it. And often the track sessions were evening. There was a big social side as well. So it was really, you got out of it what you put in. And it was weird because we had Tuesday track and we had Thursday track, but Wednesday was the big social night. So Thursday track was the weirdest thing because the guys were turning up and training hard, but half of them would either be hungover or still a bit sleepy because they didn't get much sleep from the night out. And then they had a lecture the next morning. Yeah, university's a weird life. You sort of just rattle through it. it. And it's kind of like a strange roller coaster if you choose to get on board. Some people don't and have a very mild university experience, but I think you've got to make the most of it.
That's good. Is there a whole kind of circuit with the universities whereby you're competing against other universities, or does the University Athletics Club send runners to various races? Are there some that are picked? How does that all work?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, multiple different facets and different ways that can happen. A big one was called varsity. I think that's quite a universal term when there's a competition between two universities. For us as Portsmouth, it was the University of Southampton, which kind of became mildly ironic because then I ended up moving to Southampton for a while and trained at that exact track where I went to compete in varsity. So I always felt like I was behind enemy lines when I was in Southampton. It was quite a surreal experience. But yeah, varsity, and there was also Southampton Solent, which is another university there. So it was kind of like a bit of a trifecta competing. But the big one was between Southampton and Portsmouth. So yeah, we'd compete against them once a year, and you scored points based. I don't know how they worked out the point system. It was mad, but that was the big one. And then there was just the university championships. And I remember going to, I'm probably gonna get this place wrong, I feel like it was maybe Sheffield or Leeds, I can't remember, going and competing there and I ran an 800 meters for the university, and I've also been in and competed at 5k, and then competed at cross country, which was some of the best memories because we did a cross country trip to Edinburgh, and we took a minibus from Portsmouth to Edinburgh and back. So wow. It was an absurd drive, and just sort of piled into this minibus, drove up there, took on an insane cross country course, did okay but nothing special because the level there is very, very high. Go on a night out, you sort of get a few hours sleep, and then you're driving back again. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of how it works. It's a whole different range. And it kind of depends on your university as well. Some universities pride themselves on being very, very strong with their runners. Loughborough is a fantastic example. Brunel is another university that steeped in history of their running.
It's actually funny you should say that. Loughborough has come up before on, I can't remember who it was I interviewed, somebody who went to Loughborough University and just said that the competitiveness there was just incredible. Obviously, the love for the running shone through at university, and you were obviously enjoying it so much, and you got super involved there because you eventually ended up captaining the team. Was that for a whole year or just for a short while?
Yeah, I should caveat that one because it sounds very impressive. So what happened was I was going for the captaincy in my third year. I knew it was kind of building to it. There was rustlings of conversation in second year that maybe I should go for it. And it's all, you go up and you give your talk and why you should be in a quick presentation. It was ridiculous. We got like 3 minutes to present, which is not much time. And then last minute, I don't recall exactly how it happened. My memory's a little vague on it, but they just split the captaincy out of nowhere into sprints captain and then like a cross country captain. Maybe cross country was meant to be distance as well. So I ended up in a weird position where I sort of went for sprints captain, even though, yes, originally my background was 400 and 800 meters. Yes, 800 meters is kind of the beginning of middle distance, but arguably pretty much is still a sprint. So I sort of ended up becoming sprints captain, and there was like a cross country captain. So it got into this very strange position where I don't think it was the best decision in the world. Somehow I still got sprints captain, even though no one knew I was a sprinter, just because I think I did quite a detailed presentation on why I should be a captain. And then it was the sort of that captaincy and that role was sort of shared out, and you just kind of ended up in a bit of a leadership role. But it was really, really an amazing experience and beautiful to kind of cap it off with having a slight position of authority to kind of bring in the new people and help people with their own training and things like that. And I remember the president was a guy called Martin Shelley, one of the most amazing individuals I've ever met. And his life surrounded, whenever I think of anything in life, if you ever want to dedicate yourself to something, I always think of this guy, Martin Shelley, and Portsmouth University Athletic Clubs for the period of somewhere from 2010 to about 2014. This guy lived and breathed the club. And he was the kind of guy that would skip lectures just to work on details of how we were going to get the team to a race. I mean, this guy was just in love with it, to the point where, I mean, I haven't spoken to him in a long time, but you'd almost fall off the bandwagon off something like that because he was so involved, and that was such his life. He was an incredible president. And that other guy I mentioned, Dan Green, he was a phenomenal 400 meter runner combined with a fantastic personality who could just speak to a group of people and they would just listen. He was an incredible captain as well. So I was walking in the footsteps of giants, really.
That's amazing. But there'll be people who will remember you as captain coming into the university who will probably have similar things to say. You hope, yeah.
Yeah, you hope so. You hope so. You never know, do you? You never know.
No, that's really good, and I like the fact that you say, with those positions, the main thing you got out of it is being able to help people with their running. and just be able to kind of give something back to the community, because there are so many people out there who want to get into the sport, but then also people out there who, like you say, dedicate their entire lives to it, and they're just so dedicated to it that you're kind of in awe of where they find the time and the energy and effort to do it. So somewhere, and I always try and draw a timeline here on the show, but somewhere between university and maybe a year or maybe even at the same time as you left university, or perhaps maybe even a little bit of overlap as well, the first podcast came to be.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how that came out. Was it anything to do with university itself? Had you had the idea beforehand, or how was it born?
So if you remember when I was in that tent in first year and I marched up to Dan Green and I say, yes, I'm going to be a part of your athletics club. Now, I'd never said what the second society was I joined. And so I carry on wandering around, quite happy that I was now a part of the athletics society and looking forward to my first Wednesday night beach run, as it was going to be that day. Okay. And there was a man on a stage with a microphone called Ollie Ing, who was doing announcements. And he was part of the Radio Society at the time. And I remember looking up and they had this, I don't know how on earth they got this, but they had a full lorry with half the side off. And he was just there on a microphone, just being like, guys, welcome. You know, he had a fantastic radio voice. I ended up doing a few shows with him on, weirdly enough, on the Portsmouth local radio station. Skip forward a couple of years. I got the opportunity to then co-host a show with him on Express FM for a little while, which was phenomenal and weird how things come full circle. Anyway, I'm looking up at this guy on a lorry and thought, that's fantastic. Now, bearing in mind, this isn't completely alien to me because I was going in to do drama. So, you know, the idea of presenting and standing on stage and blah, 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 well, it's not an alien concept. But that really set the wheels in motion for the idea that perhaps instead of chasing acting, which is always what I've been about, that maybe you can get a bit of a buzz off actually just being yourself and not having to develop a character for 3 months and then just perform for 3 nights of ecstasy, and instead get a mild buzz out of being on a microphone and hosting and presenting. So that kind of sowed the seed. And I ended up joining the Radio Society and started a show. I had a stage name at the time. I called myself Horatio. It was a bit of a weird period, but I just kind of ran with it. Portsmouth University Radio Experience, so it's called Pure FM. That's the acronym. So I did a show there. I remember I was in the slot just before something called Tea Time with Emma, which was this other student who just basically sat and drank a cup of tea and chatted about her day. Worst show in the world, but you know, that's the kind of environment you're in. And I think really that acted as a sort of a boxing ring, if you like, to try and hone some sort of skills to become vaguely listenable on a microphone. I remember the first song I ever played, for example, was a song by Mumford & Sons. And I think it was Little Lion Man, which swears about partway through. And they somehow on the system, because it's university radio and clearly it was completely uncensored and unpoliced like those races I talked to you about, essentially had some songs that they just hadn't done the radio edit on. So there was still swearing. So the first song I ever played had swearing in, and I panicked and had switched it off and apologized, and I was pretty flustered really by the whole thing, but for whatever reason stuck with it and just developed this radio show. And then it's weird because I'm doing the course on the side and I'm doing the acting, so I have this weird dichotomy as I'm going through the 3 years of thinking, well, I'm here learning scripts and studying plays and doing all this, but at the same time, I'm popping up every week on this radio show and getting to take a couple of calls from listeners and play some music and tell a story. And do you know what? This is way less effort, almost in a lazy way. That was kind of the disparity. That's kind of how that developed, and I started in the radio.
Okay, so I guess I kind of get what you're talking about there, where the acting is, you know, you're having to develop the character and learn lines. Yeah, doing the radio is just like you say, you're just being yourself, you're just talking and having a good time and interviewing somebody or chatting about a certain topic. So I can kind of see how that's like you say, a little bit less effort and just more natural. But how did it lead to you wanting to start a podcast about running?
Yeah, so basically I left university and I'd done the Radio Society for a few years and obviously left the athletics club. And I also joined the Television Society for a little while, so I ended up presenting on camera as well. And I left with this slightly confused experience of, this is strange, because it was the first time in my life I'd ever questioned there being something other than me acting. Like that was just it from age 4 when I was taken to seeing Jack and the Beanstalk. I think it was the Bristol Hippodrome by my own mum. And apparently it's the first time I shut up and just sat down and watched something. Right through to that moment, sort of halfway through university, I just kind of had a bit of an epiphany, really, that perhaps it didn't have to be acting, but it could be something along that line in the form of presentation and just sort of being myself and not having to be, you know, John the binman from down the road who gets 3 lines on Act 4 or whatever. Really, what happened then was I got in contact. That guy I mentioned, Ollie Ing, he had a contact at an actual radio station, so not a university radio, it's like an actual proper commercial radio station. And so I joined the events team. I started doing event work for this this radio station in Southampton. They owned a number of radio stations. At the time, it was called Jack FM, which was also quite big in Bristol.
FM.
Yeah. So they're weirdly enough, if you're able to see my microphone muff right now, it's actually a Jack FM microphone muff I still have from the offices.
Brilliant.
And I just have it sort of as a bit of a memorabilia. Reminds me where I originally came from. And so I kind of just fell into the world of radio, and I moved to Southampton on the basis that I had essentially a 0-hour contract just doing bits of radio work. So I picked up some bar work and basically just supported myself trying to work my way up in radio. And fast forward probably a couple of years, I got a phone call one day from quite a significant radio presenter by the name of Bam Bam, who I'm still in contact with to this day. And we still catch up and still work on projects together, working on a couple of things right now, actually.
I've heard Bam Bam before because I've heard Bam Bam on the radio.
Amazing. Was that in London at the time, or was that on Sam FM or Jack FM?
It's probably Sam FM or Jack FM that I've heard Bam Bam. Yep.
Yeah. He used to go bam, 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 and there would be some crazy clip. Well, basically, there was him and there was a couple of co-hosts, and one of the co-hosts dropped out, weirdly enough, to do a podcast. His podcast was on share prices. I mean, can you think of a podcast on anything more dull? But I guess
I was just about to say, really?
Yeah, how crazy is that? But like full time that he could actually pull out. And I remember that was a big light switch as well. My God, this guy's actually leaving a very well-established medium, as it is now. We can go on to that, but arguably slowly dying medium now that is radio. And my God, he's going full time with a podcast. Someone's going to pay him a salary to do a pod. So anyway, that was amazing. Bam Bam, who'd met me a couple of times in a corridor, thought that maybe I could possibly speak on the microphone. He'd seen me hoovering a hall or, waving a flag at an event. And I just got given this fantastic once in a lifetime opportunity to join the breakfast show. I mean, the way it works in radio is usually they'd start you off on an evening show. You might then get a lunchtime bit. You might do a couple of voiceover gigs. I did get to do a couple of voiceovers, but I just sort of was thrown straight in the deep end as a producer of a breakfast show on what was then called Sam FM. It changed its name for long, complicated reasons. And I found myself in front of Bam Bam, who had a wealth of experience, years and years behind the microphone. And I'm there with, a couple of years doing radio and sort of an acting degree and trying to find my way. And I ended up doing it for over a year, and it was brilliant and it was incredible. But Bam himself and then a couple other people, just the whisperings of podcasts was starting to come into the air around me, really. And I really looked more into it. And I think one of the myths is you can listen to someone on radio. The grass is always greener. You listen to someone on the radio right now. If you turn the radio on, you think, my God, they've got the best job in the world. But I bet you behind that, there's probably a producer who just told them off playing the wrong song. They probably wish that this button that isn't working did work. They have to get up way earlier. There's always negatives. And with the radio show, it was brilliant. But of course, there were going to be downsides. Like we didn't have that much control. And I think the beautiful thing about podcasts, as you're probably finding doing this podcast, is that you have control. You can do what you want. There's no one telling you, right, in 5 minutes, you've got to play Rihanna. And then in 6 minutes, you've got to take that phone call and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And we actually had quite a lot of freedom on this show. But after that show, I would have gone to maybe Heart, Capital. It would have been something like that. Would have been the next step. They're given like 6 minutes to talk every hour and just say, hi, Shelley just called in. She's just had a cup of soup. What do you think of cup of soup? Let me know after this song, Rihanna, and then put the fader up.
Yeah, that's true. I can imagine it's very structured. Yep.
It's not really you. You're just a voice, So so that crept in. Now, you'll probably be very aware of Couch to 5K, which was that big app. I think the NHS did a version. Apparently, it was originally started in the 90s. I only just found out, which is crazy.
Wow.
But anyway, so I was quite intrigued by that, and that seemed to be catching on. And it's just getting bigger and bigger, Couch to 5K. So I thought I would do my own version of that. So that was the real beginnings, to answer your question, of the podcast, was to do my own version of Couch to 5K, which I'd called Slob to Running Snob. Kind of based off the fact that my voice is naturally a bit posh, because after I was dragged away from the north, growing up in the Cotswolds, you either go farmer or you get a posh accent. And so this is how my accent turned out, if you can call it.
I think you've got a lovely accent, Harry.
Oh, thanks. It's a bit Queen's English, but I have met people posher, and I can promise you that is posh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I started Slob to Running Snob, the idea being it would originally it was going to be like a 10-part episodic series where it takes you from being a slob through to being a running snob, where you can almost talk about your own marathon experiences. That was the kind of concept, and he did all right. The image for it was me with a pipe in my mouth and holding a pair of trainers. There was a strong idea and aesthetic behind it. I used to go in and I used to record bits at the radio station, and then another community radio station where I was doing a show as well. So the sound quality was great from the start because I got access to a studio. And like anything, you procrastinate, things happen, people appear, people disappear, and I just it fell by the wayside. And before long, it had been 5 months, and I remember I was doing that Slob to Running Snob thing. And then I don't know what it was, but I remember just having a bit of a wake-up call, like, come on, you had something good there going, Harry. And yes, you're working your way up in radio, but it was when I hit the breakfast show, I thought, no, this is when I really need to start doing something on the side. Because when you do a breakfast show, you finish at 10 o'clock in the morning. It's amazing. So you have the rest of the day free. And yes, half the time you are going back to sleep. Because
I was going to say, you're probably knackered from waking up early.
You woke up at 4:30, 5 o'clock to do a show. It was insane. I was a zombie for a year, basically.
Yeah.
So I really started to develop the idea. And that combined with, so not many people know this, I barely ever talk about it, but I actually then started doing a different podcast that's called the Brain Training Podcast. You can still find it on iTunes. It's the most downloaded podcast I've ever been on. It was doing crazy numbers, a few thousand downloads every day this thing did.
Wow. Okay.
Eventually it hit 500,000 downloads, which is nuts to think about it. And I was just the voice of that, basically saying, add 4 + 7 or whatever the brain arithmetic game was.
Really? That sounds so interesting. I'm going to have to go and search for this.
Yeah, just Brain Training Podcast. Now, the last episode was something like October 2017. Nothing else has happened with it. It'd be great to start it up again, because I think if we'd kept pushing it, we probably could have got it to a level where 10,000 US downloads, potentially there's monetization there, things like that. It was a strong concept, and we were in people's routine, and it was daily, and it was only a few minutes for each episode, so it was systematic, and we had a system of doing it. So anyway, seeing the numbers of that, it was very exciting, and I just thought, no, I've got to do it now. But Slob to Running Snob seemed like it had a bit of a ceiling, like what happens once you become a running snob? It had a ceiling to it. I just felt like there was more I could do, and I felt like bringing running with presenting together would happen in the form of a finally fully fledged podcast. And I was sat in a Debenhams cafe one day with a guy from one of the radio stations, and we were sort of brainstorming ideas and going back and forth. And I remember we were coming up with episode ideas for Slob to Running Snob. And fortunately, it was me. Otherwise, I would happily credit him. But it was actually me over this cup of coffee that said, well, jog on is quite a good term. People used to say that, didn't they? Well, jog on, mate. That was just a sort of an expression. And that kind of has that running air to it. And then we sort of stared at the piece of paper. I just scribbled it down. And I said, you know what? That's really good. And then we sort of said, well, we could just call the podcast that, The reason I was talking to him is because he had a bit of a sort of podcast hosting platform at the time that he was trying to build. And I was one of the featured podcasts on it. This thing was getting a very small amount of traffic. So on that day in 2015, I don't remember the month, Jog On was born, and that was it really. It was just building ideas from there. I'll cut it short, but basically released it, published it, went big. It sort of didn't quite hit right. I didn't release it on quite the right platform, tailed off. Christmas happened, ate too much turkey, didn't record for ages, and then didn't renew my subscription with this hosting platform, and it got pulled down off iTunes and blah, 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 and it stopped. So that was 2017, so it's gone. July 2018, I re-upload, reinvigorated to really do this thing. And from July 18 to today, Jog On is in its current form and has been moving forward. But it's a very slow and long process. It's fascinating to talk to you as someone who's doing it themselves now. I know it's meant to be you asking questions, but I was going to ask you, like, how have you found this process starting a podcast? Are you enjoying it?
Oh, thanks for asking. I am actually, and I'm really enjoying kind of hearing how yours kind of started, because obviously this was born because I was having conversations with runners out on the seafront and in races and meeting people, and conversations that I felt would be great if they were just captured somewhere for other people to hear, to share experiences and share stories and share information. But yeah, no, the whole experience has been fun. It was a little bit daunting at first, like you were speaking about earlier with you said your friend had a hosting site. There was a lot of reading I had to do, a lot of kind of fiddling around with settings on the hosting sites and getting my files uploaded in the right format and stuff. But there's a little bit of kind of technical work you need to do if you're going to do that stuff yourself. But there are many services out there, I think, that do it for you or do a lot of it for you. That part's been difficult. I still haven't yet signed or got the podcast onto Spotify, which I need to do at some point. I found that bit a little bit of a kind of a dark art, getting your RSS feed in the right place and finding those settings and things. So it's been tricky. Did you have any of those kind of similar technical challenges along the way?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a steep learning curve, isn't it? It's a lot to learn with podcasting. I think there's this idea out there that you flick on a mic, you press record, you press publish, and bang, you're a podcaster. But actually, there's a lot more to it. And you're right, RSS feeds are a geeky subject, but essentially they can come with their own problems. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how it moves over the next few years. I'm really impressed that you started it, because I know how tough it is, but even more so that you carried on, because I don't know what percentages are exactly, but the stats are crazy for the amount of podcasts that are started, and then they release anywhere from 3 to 10 episodes, and then it's been 2 years, and it's just used to be a guy who did a couple of podcast episodes, and it's a very hard thing to consistency. It's like running. You have to have endurance, and you have to keep going and push through even when you don't feel like it and it gets tough, and you will reap benefits.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I completely agree with what you say. it's something that you have to persevere through, because I have times where I think, cracky, I've got some really hectic stuff going on with work, the family's busy, we've got these arrangements on this week, and I've got to build an interview, and there's a fair bit of research. I don't know how you manage that, but because I know every podcast is different, but I like to build a lot of questions and do a bit of research online about the person I'm interviewing to find out a bit more. And you really have to kind of throw yourself in it, based on the fact that we both love running. It makes it a lot easier.
Absolutely.
But there's a fair bit of planning that needs to go on to make the shows happen, and it's a brilliant process. Don't get me wrong. I love doing it every single time, and every time I finish an interview, I'm enthralled and go like a really big high out of it. But yeah, it's tricky and difficult, but again, it's fun. You do get to do what you want to do, and you don't have to go to anybody else's schedule. So it's been pretty fun as well.
You're right. You can come out of a conversation really pumped, and I think that the pumped upness is only increased threefold if you've done your research. Exactly what you said. To really look into the history. And the beautiful thing is, there's so much out there. I mean, I think if people really realised how public they are in their profiles and the things they put online, they probably wouldn't post as much, because as someone who needs to then find stuff out about people, it's quite rare is a time when you find someone who's a bit ghost-like online. Like, generally, there's a lot of stuff. You can really, just in an hour, you can find out a lot about someone without even being friends with them or signed up to anything of theirs or following them in any way. It's amazing. You can find out so much. And there's been a couple of moments where I think I've even said something and they've kind of given me that look across the microphone. You might not even hear it in the audio form. I do it in video form as well on a separate podcast YouTube channel. Sometimes you see it and that expression, that flicker of moment in the face of, how did you know that? Because you can actually get quite in depth. So I think it's absolutely something that you go into the conversation looking forward to it more when you're like, well, I can't wait to ask them about that, because I know that in 2007 they did that thing because they mentioned it in that blog or whatever it is. And then you come out all the more satisfied that you really spoke to that person and got to them quite quickly. And people will open up a lot to you. That's one of the amazing things I've found is people are very, very, very willing to talk about quite deep personal subjects with you, even with a microphone in front of their face. There's an element of, as a typical English person, I think our culture is very much restrained sometimes. We're quite civil and quite polite.
Yes. Yeah.
So people don't really get the opportunity to talk about their deeper stuff. And sometimes all it takes is just asking them about it, and they will open up and give you some fascinating anecdotes.
So yeah, you've just got to build a comfortable environment where people feel safe and secure and happy and maybe a little bit informal. And yeah, you're right. People do open up, and I've always said this, if there's one thing runners like doing, apart from running, it's talking about running. It does make life a little bit easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. It plays into our hands as running podcasts. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, people who really aren't on that running scene think, why on earth you run and then you also listen to someone talking about running? I mean, that's insane. But people get really into their hobbies, their passions, whatever it is they're into.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. To summarize your running history in terms of races, I guess you've done everything, pretty much every distance, now the ultras as well. Do any big races stick out apart from the ultra, which I'd love to talk about in a bit?
I think, to be honest, again, it would probably be those moments where I ran a personal best. I think it had such an effect on me. It's just such a culmination of training, and it's such a strong achievement. And I think because it's been such a long time since I ran a personal best, it's been a few years now. It's a very long story why that happened. To answer your question, yeah, really probably those personal best moments. One of the absolute standout moments was, again, this is going to be one of those races where I can't remember quite the title of the race. It's a 10K just outside of Southampton. Again, a bit of a club heavy race, so quite a high standard. Personal best, it was sort of low 39s, which I'd run a long, long way back. And yeah, and everything was sort of coming together, and I really felt like I was on for a half decent time. And I thought possibly I could run a 38, maybe I could run a 38 if everything came together. And the course had a couple of gradient slopes in which, when you're going for personal best, it matters whether that road tilts up a bit. You feel it. And my dad was in London at the time. It was really strange, but he just happened to be able to get some time between meetings, like a good few hours, to drive over from London to this race to watch me and clap me.
That's dedication.
And then had to drive straight back for another meeting. And it was amazing that he did it. And everything just came together. And there was the perfect scenario where there was a couple of other guys who were coming down. I was doing CrossFit quite heavily at the time, and there was a couple of other guys from CrossFit who were still very decent runners, which was amazing because they barely did any running, but just through their natural fitness were just fantastic male runners anyway. And one guy ran 39 that day. But somehow it was a bit of a Bob Beamon moment where I leapt 38 entirely, and I landed. I still remember to this day. I got 37.49, as you mentioned earlier on. I remember it was one of those moments where everything came together so well that I wasn't even that tired. You know, when you sometimes see a guy run a world record, and let's say, first of all, that's probably very questionable when it does happen. But that thing where people say they didn't even look tired. You know, Kipchoge would be a good example when he runs his sub 2 is 1:59.40. When he crosses that line, he looks like he's been for a Sunday stroll in the church graveyard. He doesn't look like he just ran the human endurance record of our generation, let alone probably the history of the world. And I did the same thing. I kind of ran through the finish line and then just kept running and sort of banging my chest. And my dad was standing slightly further down, and I ran, and because it was a smaller race, you could do this because there wasn't much in the way of crowds. Burst back across where I'd just come across finishing straight. I remember jumping on him. I mean, I must have crushed the poor man because, you know, I'm over 6 foot tall and he's not quite as big as I am. But I was so elated, and it was this amazing, you know, your father and son, you shake hands. And I was so elated to see, because, you know, the time was right there. I had it on my watch. It was all the same. I knew I'd done it. 37.49. And I couldn't believe it. But then I think what was so special is because I'd been dreaming about the idea of ducking under 39, getting 38, and to skip that entirely and go to 37, which when you know 10K times, as you start to get lower in those 30s, every 60 seconds as a percentage of the time, just mathematically, is that much more important. So incrementally, it was just better and better and better. And I think from that moment on, I think I always believed quite strongly in my running, but it was the first time I really went, oh no, I think I can really run. Like I think I could do some good times now. Like it,
I get you.
It was permission to really start to believe. So now it's about getting back to foot on the gas, if you like, to use a slight Americanism, and go for it again, because that was an amazing moment. So that was a real standout, was coming across that finish line, jumping on my dad, shouting at him, because he couldn't see from where he was at the time, was shouting 37.9, 37.49, and seeing the amazement and hopeful pride that was clearly on his face. It was just one of those very raw moments, you know, where social decorum went out the window, and it was just a very passionate moment.
And your dad drove back to the office and took off his jacket in the office, and he had footprints all over him more, and had to brush off the grass off of his head, of his back.
Yeah, somehow had to go back into a meeting after having been attacked by his son. Yeah,
that's incredible, and a really good time. You know, Harry, well done. I must have felt really great doing that. But have you done any marathons?
Yeah, that's the weird one. So I've done some halves. No, I've never officially done a marathon. The only thing is the thing you mentioned, which is the 100-mile run, which ended up being basically a marathon every day, trail marathon every day for 4 days in a row.
Okay.
A bit weird to have not done an official marathon. And again, this was coming back to our thing of having perhaps minor mental blocks. I think maybe there's a slight mental block with the marathon, that when you do it, you want to do it partly well. You want to have put the training in. You or I could go out and let's say neither of us did much training for a few weeks. I think naturally off some basic fitness, we could go out and just do a very low intensity marathon. There is in our culture the idea that 26.2 miles is this absurdly long way. It is built up a bit much, when really, if you look back at it, we're built for endurance. We sweat and we are at low intensity.
I agree fully. Yeah.
We can cover huge distances, and people would be stunned how far they can go, but they have to build up to get through those mental barriers. So I think for me, it's a case of I'm not fazed by the distance in any way, shape or form. It's more just giving out a half decent time, because I know exactly what's a mediocre time, what's a good time, what's a great time for me and my abilities. You know, that's variable per person. And
I respect that fully. So you're just waiting for the right one, the right time, and where you get a good block of training in.
What kind of distances are you doing at the moment? Are you training for? You seem to be doing quite some long stuff at the moment.
Yeah, I tend to try and keep myself in marathon shape all through the year, and it's been like that now for, I don't know, probably for 4 years or so, I guess. I've just enjoyed just in that routine of Tuesday hard training session, Thursday hard training session, Sunday either 1 or 2 long runs, Saturday and Sunday. And I've been in that pattern now for so long that I think my body's just always long distance ready. But recently, I mean, I was meant to run the Thames Path 100, which was last weekend, but I had to cancel the rescheduled date because it fell on the same date as my daughter's birthday. So I'm going to run it again next year. But yeah, I tend to generally be ready to run a marathon to 50 miles most of the year. So I'm kind of always in that long run category.
No, that's brilliant.
Yeah, but at the same time, I like to also try and stretch myself at the speed as best as I can. And I think, like you touched on earlier, unless you're doing that kind of 80%, intensity in that zone, you're never going to do your absolute best at the speed. But I tend to try and pull out what I can.
Absolutely, yeah.
I realize I've taken far too much of your time already, so I kind of wanted to end off with a couple of questions about the show in particular, and just ask what shows have you got coming up.
The next one's crazy. My next episode, and so this is where Jog On, I think, is really starting to step up a level a little bit. So this is with a fantastic guy called Will Cockrell, and actually where I'm sitting right now is where he sat opposite me, and just the most incredible conversation about his journey in running and his life. And he was just the most informative man who could just pull marathoners from the 70s, names, people I'd never even heard of, just out and give me incredible anecdotes. But the main bulk of the conversation, the reason I was talking to him, is because he's been investigating a world record that stood since 2002, which is the Jogle or the Jog record, which is the acronym for John O'Groats to Land's End or Land's End to John O'Groats, which is this, I think it's 874 miles, usually done from Land's End to John O'Groats, that way around, that multiple people over the years have taken a punt at trying to break the record.
Including recently Dan Lawson.
Exactly, including Dan Lawson, and which we also discussed. But weirdly, we actually recorded just before Dan Lawson. He was just about to start. So I'm going to sort of add in a bit of contextual information for people who don't know about what Dan Lawson ended up doing. Now, the record's held, it's May 2002. A guy completed it by the name of Andy Rivet, and it's this incredible performance of 9 days, 2 hours, and I forget the minutes, 29 minutes or something like that.
I know the record well, yeah.
And Will himself comes on to basically express a number of concerns about that record. And he's been researching this thing for 2 years, actually went and met with Andy Rivet and spent an hour with him and interviewed him there. So is the guy on the subject in terms of taking it to Guinness World Records, trying to get Guinness World Records to act on this. And he really deconstructs in the episode with me. I mean, I was just, excuse the pun, but riveted by the conversation, just listening. I mean, I barely speak during the episode. It's just me going, because I'm really fascinated in what he's saying. It's incredible. And he really deconstructs the reasons why the record itself, he feels, is incredibly dubious. There are huge questions surrounding it. The validity of the record is really brought into question in the episode, and it is fascinating. And I think the thing about this episode is it's got that kind of punch to it of it's this story and it's the real life thing, and he's trying to get this done with GWR, Guinness World Records. For me, with Jog On now, sort of a couple of years into the podcast, 1 year into the YouTube channel, I really feel like it's this kind of episode I really want to start to push a bit more, almost like a slight kind of running journalism edge to it. Maybe not even me investigating, but people who have done investigation coming on and talking about their findings. And then on the YouTube channel, I'm always putting out videos, and once Parkrun and other races are back, I'll probably be documenting more of those. I sort of do vlog style running around and voiceovers and music, and trying to create them into miniature running films, really, that hopefully are mildly entertaining for people to watch.
Great stuff. Yeah, you know that story about Le Jog or Joggle, or Le Jog, as they sometimes call it. It's interesting because I recently heard Robbie Britton, who biked alongside Dan Lawson's record attempt, which he successfully did, talk about this recently. And he said that I think there's been quite a few people who have been questioning that record for so long, because I think that Andy Rivet came out of nowhere, really, and just ran this incredible run of 9 days and 2 hours, like you said, and then just disappeared. And there was no evidence. I think there was something similar, and I don't want to give anything away because it may be spoken about in your show, but I'm pretty sure that Robbie Britton on a podcast I listened to earlier today said that it was like back then you could just get like a police officer to sign saying, yeah, he saw you somewhere. Great, there you go, sign a thing, and then a photo.
Yeah, it was essentially done on an honours code back in 2002.
Yeah,
I mean,
pretty much.
And as Will Cockrell states in the episode, he says, a photo means nothing. It just means you were there in that place at that time. It doesn't represent 874 miles. He says maybe if they gave Guinness 52,000 photos of him every few meters, maybe I'll listen, kind of thing. But
Correct.
he said it means nothing.
I'm very excited to hear that, and I think everyone should get on and do that. How can people follow you on social media and sign up to receive episodes as they're released?
Yeah, so hopefully on most major podcast platforms at this point, Spotify and Apple Podcasts itself. I've tried it myself. You can literally just type in Jog On. There are sort of slightly longer terms I use. The YouTube channel is called Jog On with Harry Morgan. Just Jog On alone should pull the channel up. And then the video podcast, I've kind of split YouTube in half. So the video podcasts, so the podcast you can actually watch visually, are Jog On Podcast with Harry Morgan. So just adding in the word podcast. So Jog On with Harry Morgan for all the main videos, and Jog On Podcast with Harry Morgan for the video podcast. But yeah, just jog on any podcast platform. And I think the big thing with podcasts, and I think for yourself as well, is giving a rating or review is very helpful, and certainly hitting subscribe. But the big thing I think really is just if you really enjoy a podcast and you really want to help a show because they're giving you free content and hopefully entertaining you every once in a while when they put out episodes, it's just to tell someone else about it. One of the ways I found is if you're in the car with someone, like, so if someone's listening to the Portsmouth Running Podcast as they're driving through Scotland or wherever it is, and they've got someone else in the car who's a runner, and you've got a long journey together, You can just put it on, and they kind of go, oh, this is good. And the word of mouth will remain king for a long time, I believe. And I think the biggest way people can help is they really enjoy something, just sharing or just saying to someone, I know you've been listening to a few running podcasts. I'd really recommend this one. The Portsmouth Running Podcast. It's Daniel Piccolo is excellent. You should really, and that goes a long, long way. So I do Jog On tops now. I've got running tops with which I've sold a fair few now, which is cool to have the merchandise. And that's brilliant that people show that support. But really the biggest thing is just turning to someone saying, yeah, you should check that out sometime, and just sharing an episode that hopefully they enjoy. And that's how these things slowly grow, and it is a slow process. But
wise words.
We'll get there.
Yeah, wise words. Thanks for that. Very, very good. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. Share it. I think that's really, really wise. So thanks. Listen, Harry, I've taken way too much of your time. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the show, and I know you've listened to a couple of episodes, and I appreciate it, and all the hard work you put into Jog On. It's fantastic. I highly recommend people go and listen to it. And listen, good luck with breaking those Steve Morgan PBs and targets.
Yeah, we'll get there one day. No, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to actually be on the other side. As someone who has some vague idea of what they're talking about when it comes to podcasting, I've been doing it a little while now. I actually think you're a fantastic host, Daniel. So I think I really do recommend you stick at it and keep it up, because I think what you're doing is very listenable, very entertaining. And I really think you're keeping the conversation alive about running. And I think I've listened to a few running podcasts, dipped in and out, and I already think this is right up there. So keep up what you're doing. It's brilliant. And stick at it. And I'm sure one day we will be back running together and doing another podcast at some point.
Well, I tell you what, I would love to get together with you in the future and maybe do a little kind of segment of the show, because we're mixing up our format in the future anyway, and perhaps maybe even just come on and talk about a couple of the episodes that we've had or whatever. We can always get together and discuss things. So yeah, it'd be great to mix up a run. Have a fantastic birthday in a couple of weeks, and good luck with all the running.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate it.
Take care. Cheers.